Hello and welcome to So Now What with Gates Cambridge, a podcast tackling some of the world's wicked problems with those who are dedicated to doing something about them. I'm Catherine Galloway, and my guests, as always, are Gates Cambridge scholars working to make an impact in the lives of others. 110 years ago this July, the first shots were fired in our First World War, a conflict known then as the Great War. So certain were its survivors that they would never see its like again. They were, of course, mistaken. And this July, as NATO holds its 75th birthday party in Washington against the backdrop of some of the most serious regional conflicts in decades, many commentators are wondering what else we've got wrong about war. My guests today have direct experience of this shimmering landscape of uncertainty, fear, and pain. Their own lives, careers, and worldviews shaped permanently by witnessing extreme violence or its aftermath. But all of them have chosen to take words and action to construct a different future, ready to ask over and over again, how can culture be an agent of peace? Joining me on Zoom today, I'm honoured to welcome two members of the Gates Cambridge class of 2012, Sarah Clark-Habibi, dialing in from Geneva, Switzerland, and Jockey Wamai, speaking from Nairobi, Kenya. Also on Zoom, Irena Shuvalova, currently based in Oslo, and speaking to us today from there. Thank you all very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And thank you all for agreeing to come together and to find the words to discuss peace at a moment where there appears no end in sight for the pain in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, and elsewhere. Sarah, you've spent over 20 years as a peace educator and peacebuilding consultant, starting in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where you led the first post-war peace education and reconciliation programme, and continuing across many of the most traumatised places on earth, including Rwanda, Cambodia, Israel and Palestine, Lebanon and Ukraine. Currently based at the Peace Division at the UN Institute for Training and Research, you believe we must abandon the narratives of supremacy, pride and grievance that lead directly to conflict and work instead towards wider cultures of shared humanity. Jockey, you grew up under the regime of Kenya's longest-serving president, Daniel Arap Moi, and later witnessed the tumultuous aftermath of disputed elections in 2007, both experiences shaping your life as an activist and as an academic. Your research in politics and international relations at United States International University Africa examines who is represented and who gets forgotten in peacebuilding, particularly when international institutions get involved. And what might change, you ask, if we considered things through a feminist, Africanist lens? Irena, your country, Ukraine, is at war right now. And as an award-winning poet, translator and educator, you're wondering how to find the words to speak for those you call those unsilenceable people of mine. Your poetry has been translated into 27 languages, with your latest work in Ukrainian End Songs published this spring, and your English language collection, Pray to the Empty Wells, praised in The Guardian earlier this year as a revelation. As a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oslo, you're currently teaching and writing on Russian propaganda and the weaponisation of culture. Now, we're going to work together on how to find the words for all this today. But first, I'd love you to tell me the one thing that you're bringing to the table today that's going to help us get started. Jockey, let's start with you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I'm bringing to this conversation the African cultures of peace. There's one very popular, it's both a culture and also a way of living. I mean, it's a way of living and a concept. It's a culture and a concept, and that is Ubuntu, especially in South Africa. And then within the East African region where we use Kiswahili, Utu. Utu is our humanity or humanity, Utu. In Swahili, it just means humanity, your personhood or your humanness, Utu. And then Ubuntu means our interconnectedness as human beings. I am because we are, and because we are, I am. So we cannot live as individuals. We live in this interconnected space where we have a shared Utu or a shared humanity. And of course, now with the whole modernity, Western modernity, people have moved on, but there's a lot of also trying to reclaim and reclaim back these concepts, which were, I think, are very fundamental to creating cultures of peace.
Thank you. That's an absolutely beautiful explanation, and I hope we will bear that in mind in our conversation together today. Sarah, what about you? What are you bringing to the table today?
Thank you, Catherine. As you said, I've been working in the field of peace building for more than 20 years. And so, on the one hand, I'm bringing, I would say, sadness and frustration in light of the many new and also ongoing violent conflicts and injustices that are ravaging human communities and lives in this very moment. And on the other hand, I'm bringing today an ever deeper commitment to supporting those who work for peace, and my own commitment to refining in whatever way that I can the approaches and tools that we use for doing so. And so for me, this includes raising critical questions around the roots of cultural reproduction, especially in the field of formal education. So that will be part of the questioning and the searching and the examples that I bring to our conversation today.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And Irena, what are you bringing to the table today?
In my life, war and culture intersect in several ways. And so in today's discussion, I hope to tie those different threads together. On the one hand, I'm a scholar, I'm a researcher, and my research focuses on culture in the context of war. Specifically, I work on the occupied territories of Ukraine, and I'm looking at how Russia weaponizes culture and uses it to shift people's allegiances towards feeling more affinity with Russia as opposed to Ukraine. In addition to that, I'm a poet. And so as a poet, I write a lot about this war, which affects me personally as well. But I also interact a lot with the Ukrainian literary community, and I see the incredible resilience of that community and generally the creative people of Ukraine in the times of war. And finally, like I said, the war affects me personally, so I will also perhaps speak as a person whose loved ones are, some of them on the front lines, some of them displaced by the war, some of them endangered by the war. So that's where I'm coming from today.
Thank you very much, Irena. And could we dive straight into your poetry? I feel that's an important starting place. It's absolutely hot and of the moment. Culture, as you know, more than anyone, acts as a barometer of place and time. And when I read your English collection, Pray to the Empty Wells, it's clear that measuring the impact of now in your poetry is almost too much to bear. There's a poem called A Poet Can't Write About War, in which you say so beautifully everything that you are not, because you are not there in Ukraine right now. So you start by saying neither victim, nor participant, nor defender, nor observer, nor outsider. So who? The war gave everyone a role. What's yours? Covering your mouth with your palm. And you leave that question hanging there. And I just wondered, could you describe for us what the impact has been on Ukraine's culture in the last 2.5 years?
You know, it's been somewhat paradoxical because on the one hand, war always does mean devastation. And so it did have a devastating effect on the cultural landscape. When I say devastating, I mean both physical destruction of cultural heritage, but also of the very people who create culture. I mean, so many Ukrainian creatives are dying from this war, both from the bombs that are falling often on the civilian targets, but also people who have taken up arms to defend their country. I mean, just over the past year, you know, we lost people like Victoria Merina, who was an investigator of war crimes, but also a very talented writer. We lost a bit earlier Volodymyr Vakulenko, who was a children's books writer and who was tortured in the occupied territories for his pro-Ukrainian position. And recently we lost Maxim Kravtsov, who is a poet who was fighting at the front line and got killed in action. And those are just some of the many names. But at the same time, and that's why I said paradoxically, there has been a strengthening, almost an invigorating effect, because war provokes resilience as well. And I think the resilience of Ukrainian culture has been tremendous. Really, the collective effort, I think the realization, very, very clear one, of what we all stand for in this war, but also generally as Ukrainian people, what kind of values we hold, what kind of values we want to promote through culture, has been very clear and very distinct. And also just the amount of fantastic materials that's being generated and fantastic conversations that happen not just inside Ukraine, but also between Ukrainian creative people, including writers, and people all over the world. I think that has been very heartening. So yes, paradoxically both, but I hope we will emerge stronger from this trial.
Thank you, Irena. That's incredibly moving to even just hear a snapshot of the kind of news that you're getting on a daily basis from the cultural front line as well as the actual front line. Jockey, if we could move to you, I know that you witnessed the 60 days of turbulence, really, in the wake of the 2007 presidential election. It was a moment where the world really held its breath because there was an absolute, almost minute by minute explosion of violence following the result of that contested presidential election. And very quickly, the United Nations and the rest of the international community, all eyes were on Kenya, thinking we must stop this from becoming another Rwanda in some sense. The words genocide and ethnic conflict were used very quickly. What did it feel like for you at that time? And what did you notice was pulling people back from the brink?
Thank you. I mean, for me, I still remember we were watching TV with my mother on that December when the elections were rigged or allegedly rigged, and the TV went off because after that there was also some state of emergency. And for me, and I think not just myself, then I worked for a human rights NGO, Kenya Human Rights Commission, and we had been doing a lot of work, peace building and helping governments and local governments think through diversity so that we can reduce inequality and deal with resource sharing. So it was very, very shocking, I must say. As much as this violence had happened sporadically before, we never thought it could get to that extent. It would always be like, people will protest a bit after elections and then it's over. But sadly, it started taking, the worst turns. So it was a reckoning moment for Kenya. But 17 years down the road, and having had, 3 more elections after that, we seem to have made progress, but it's still a very, very fragile piece, very fragile. But it's important. It's what was for me more important, and especially very important in peace building, is the institutions that were put in place to address the issues that led to the violence, or what we call the root causes of the violence. It's a new constitution, which is one of the best constitutions actually we have on the African continent. We are still not there, but we are getting there. And also using that as lessons learned for the region. Remember, Kenya is within a very volatile region. The whole the Horn and the Great Lakes. And part of what I'm bringing to this conversation is also the work I do, but also as an activist, as a peace builder. I was just saying I'm coming from a meeting for the Life and Peace Institute, where I'm a board member, and we were talking about all these crises we have in the region, in DRC, in Somalia, in Ethiopia right now, in Sudan, and in South Sudan, and now we're about to have elections in all these countries, Uganda. So we have so many crises, and I think it is how do we deal with these root causes, and I think a ripe moment has to present itself. And Kenya, I think we moved our crisis to a ripe moment to start addressing the issues. We are not there, but I think I hope we can get to those moments in the other countries in the region.
Thank you, Jockey. And Sarah, I'm so conscious that this is your landscape in a way, because in this conversation we're talking about culture in the broadest sense, not just as a single piece of art being important in healing or memorializing an atrocity, but about the culture that we hold as communities, literally the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves in any given moment, all the time. What you call these mirrors of pride and pain, and instead do some work on a different narrative that might lead us elsewhere. Could you tell me some more about that?
I might summarize it differently, but indeed, a big part of my work on peace building through education examines the assumptions that underpin our cultural attitudes towards conflict and peace building. And what's so interesting is to recognize that many societies are driven on a daily basis by cultural attitudes that have a positive regard of conflict. And many of our cultural narratives are underpinned by conflict-based worldviews, which we assume are normal, are natural, are instinctual, as though education has no role in transforming instincts and raising human capacities to do things differently. So a lot of these conflict-based worldviews underpin our societies and our cultures, and we rarely question them. And that spills into collective narratives, or it stems from also collective narratives of identity, of past conflicts and wars, of past collective grievances. And it's counterbalanced by other narratives around collective pride and supremacy. And these worldviews and narratives together underpin a lot of the socialization that we receive, which supports biases and prejudices and various forms of intergroup competition and all forms of intolerance and discrimination. Therefore, it's really important in my view and in the work that I'm doing that we find ways to question, to expose, to reconsider these narratives and these worldviews and their adequacy. Society and the world is changing, and we can no longer support interstate, intrastate violent conflicts if we have any hope to address global and societal challenges in constructive ways. So therefore, we have to open ourselves up to grow out of unhelpful worldviews and narratives that no longer serve the collective good of today's world and of tomorrow's world. We need to examine the adequacy of these old habits of collective thought and behavior and adopt new strands of thinking, new strategies that help us to move forward agendas for global justice, health, well-being, and reconciliation. So outside of the political and economic sciences, if we look at this challenge and this problem more from the psychological and social sciences, the challenge, I believe, before us is to mature collectively in our psychological and social orientations. And I think this is precisely what Joki was talking about when she referred to Ubuntu. This is a psychological and social orientation where we realize our interconnectedness, and that demands an enormous maturity at a collective level. And linked to that is not just pride and pain, but it is actually the very real legacies of trauma almost all societies bear the legacies of trauma, trauma that we have either borne or trauma that we have inflicted. And a big part of the peace building work that we need to consider as well is to take very seriously the importance of healing at the individual and collective levels, healing these historical and collective traumas, which the legacies of which are a source that feeds into our conflict-based worldviews. So we can't break that cycle of violence until we do that healing and that reconciliation work.
Irena, I saw you nodding there, and I'm imagining you're wondering, but how does that work when you're in the white heat of conflict itself? And maybe the work of telling ourselves different stories can't even start yet when you're in the midst of it all. But what you are doing in your academic work in Oslo is pointing out these dangerous narratives, and in particular the narratives that Russia is portraying, as you mentioned, with this weaponization of culture idea. Could you give me one or two examples of what you mean specifically? How is Russia weaponizing culture right now? And how is Ukraine fighting back?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, thanks for pointing out the fact that it's really very hard while people are dying and destruction is being inflicted on whole communities. It's very hard to have a conversation that doesn't center on that, on the destruction and the need to stop it. But also that destruction is being enacted on the level of culture. And so Ukraine exists in the sort of post-colonial context where Russia still unfortunately tries to resurrect the imperial view of Ukrainian culture as something dubious, something not particularly meaningful, something secondary. So as you know, there's a narrative about Ukrainian language, for example, not really being a language or being a dialect of Russian. For instance, what I'm seeing when I looked at the occupied regions is that those regional narratives are being taken up and through popular culture are being tied up with the sense of Russianness. And Russianness in this sense can be presented as something very abstract, as something that sort of encompasses or embraces those smaller identities that is almost inherent in them. So let's say, there are many popular songs that speak about people of Donbass, Mother Russia will protect you. So there's no need almost in a narrative like that to establish any verifiable connection between Mother Russia and the people of Donbass, for instance. It's enough to start speaking about those things together, put a lot of, again, it's also financial, economic resources behind those, start producing films, for example, that tell the stories about that connection, whether it exists or not. Sell beautifully looking music videos that tell those stories. Pay graffiti artists to create particular murals portraying particular faces, again, with slogans shaping people's perception of those faces in a certain way. And I mean, when your landscape begins to look that way, your thinking begins to shift eventually. And so that's what, unfortunately, we see happening in the occupied regions of Ukraine. But just to add one small thing to that, because you started with, but what can we do if the war is going on? And I wanted to speak about solidarity in the sense of this post-imperial landscape. For instance, there is this new academic association now being formed by young scholars, mostly from different regions, so from the countries of the Caucasus, from the Baltic countries, from the Balkan countries, from Ukraine, from Belarus, and they are actually trying to rethink the whole framework we have of considering this region. And that solidarity is extremely important because for us, listening to, let's say, the scholars of Central Asia, reflecting on their trauma from being part of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, gives us ways to speak about our trauma. And I think that sort of shared lexicon of trauma, vocabulary of trauma, is something that also culture transmits and amplifies, and it can be something extremely useful for dealing with the trauma and coming up with some common strategies for that.
Thank you, Irena. Jockey, this idea of erasure of culture that Irena has been talking about there, I know that's something you're also very interested in from an African perspective. Whose cultures are we missing most at the moment when we talk about peace, or when we're looking around the table? Who is not there, and therefore what are we missing in building a new narrative of peace building?
Yeah, if we need to look at which peace tables are we talking about? And the most dominant peace tables, unfortunately, is Sarah's people, the United Nations, That's maybe the most resourced, the most funded, and the most dominant, if there's an issue, whether right now it's in Ukraine or any of these crises I've spoken about in the Great Lakes or in the Horn. Of course, even with the regional peace architectures like the African Union or the Great Lakes that is considered, but the most resourced is the United Nations. And the United Nations infrastructure largely is based on a very European or Eurocentric or Western perspective of thinking about peace, of thinking about justice, of thinking about how to reconcile communities. So, and rarely are they looking for these voices that we are talking about, like these African cultures of peace, like what we are talking about, Ubuntu. So till we decenter Western perspectives of peace building, Western perspectives of reconciliation, and try and globalize or center everybody's perspectives on the table, then we are missing out so many people, and we are missing out some very important, I think, perspectives that would probably help us in dealing with some of those issues.
Sarah, I mean, peace building, of course, is quieter, longer, more invisible than warmongering, which is hot and in the moment and in your face. And there's always another conflict simmering. And we know that the UN, imperfect as it is right in the heart of it all, trying to work effectively. But how can we measure success or impact in this space? What has been a personal success for you?
Measuring the impact of peace building is a super complex question. We have lightly touched on, but haven't really defined yet in this conversation what we mean by peace. And that's important before we start trying to discern whether or not we're making progress in that direction. If we think about peace as a lack of open conflict or open violence, the end of violence, then that's fairly easy to measure, because we can just gauge, are there acts of violence taking place or not. We might also count things like the achievement of peace agreements, or the decrease in incidents of direct violence or disruption, social tension. When we look at peace in a wider sense, we're looking not only at the absence of violence, but also at the presence of those conditions that enable inclusive, socially just societies that favor the whole and full development of all peoples in those societies. So in that case, what we'll be looking for as progress indicators touch on aspects of perhaps social cohesion, of inclusion, of social justice, of equitable social and economic opportunities, as well as the nonviolent resolution of conflicts and the reduction of features of conflict-based worldviews that justify violence, such as prejudice, discrimination, and even as much as toxic masculinity. We might also be looking at indicators related to healthy and positive relationships and intergroup relationships, such as families and marriages that are interreligious or intercultural or interethnic, interracial. And we might also be looking at indicators such as mental health and well-being, family stability, and other positive health indicators. These are some of the ways that researchers try to understand in what direction are societies and communities moving, whether that's towards or further away from those conditions of positive peace in the wider sense. For me personally, I am touched most deeply by the work that I've been able to contribute to, which has focused on the role of healing, social healing, in peace building and reconciliation. And And there's an intangible quality and a tangible quality to that type of work. I haven't done impact studies myself on that type of work. That's not the part that interests me most. I leave that to the data scientists. But to witness shifts in emotional color, to witness shifts in narratives of self and other, to see new generations who have grown up with the legacies of war better able to express empathy to everyone who has suffered on all sides of the conflict, to be able to realize that the history of violence and those legacies of trauma do not have to determine the future, that it comes down to a number of factors. I don't want to oversimplify it, but we have choices and options in how we shape our relationships going forward. To hear that language and to see, as Joki was giving the example of the language again of Ubuntu, and to see, for example, in the context of Rwanda, how Rwanda has systematized national processes, community processes of healing, all the way through memorialization, policies, and education systems. This is incredibly powerful work, and it is really a light to so many countries around the world that are struggling to find practical steps that they can take to advance the process of peace building and reconciliation.
Joki, I know you were an activist well before you were an academic. Do you have any examples of culture of any kind being a valuable tool in creating the world that you want to make and see as an activist?
No, I would just agree with Sarah. I think moving to those cultures of empathy. And Ubuntu and Utu is really centered on empathy, because you're thinking about the other person. And I think if a society can show it has moved to that, then we are making progress. And also the issue of dealing with toxic masculinities. So I don't have any examples off the top of my head, but I would just say, even looking at, even watching Kenya and living in Kenya, I'm seeing progress in terms of changing masculinities, but it's very interesting. On one hand, we have a growing sense of toxic masculinities because of the internet. The internet has kind of provided this opportunity for more, Andrew Tate's kind of versions here in Kenya. And also many young men who are challenging toxic masculinities that they may have grown up with, and having more empathy, not just towards, say, women and other gender identities, but also just generally, which was not there. So that I can say is changing. And I can say it's based on also those values we're talking about, which are very embedded in our African cultures. Utu, our humanity, and Ubuntu, thinking about the others and our interconnectedness.
Thank you, Joki. We keep coming back to these words. I feel like they're hanging over us like an incantation, really, to do better and to be better. If we could just conclude with you, Irena, you're a cultural worker right now in this landscape of conflict. Do you regard your role somehow as creating the conditions for that empathy? Are you trying to testify in some way through your poetry about what it means to be you and your people in this moment, to help people outside the conflict understand and support you? Is that something that you see when you sit down to write, or is it a much more personal thing?
No, absolutely. On the one hand, cultural workers, all Ukrainians outside Ukraine really have become ambassadors of their own country suddenly. And I think that's a huge shift, and it will generate an incredible number of great discussions inside Ukraine as well. However, of course, for that to happen inside Ukraine, we need to start hurting. In a sense, if a person keeps having little pieces of their body cut away, all they feel is pain. And it's impossible to have certain conversations beyond that pain. So what we really need is for that pain to stop. And then I'm really looking forward to those conversations. But we all come from some sort of place of pain, smaller pain, larger pain, community pain, maybe a very private pain. Unfortunately, or fortunately, who knows, but it's part of human life. And it's also part of any culture. When you start producing culture or studying culture in the context of war, it's absolutely amazing to see how much of any kind of culture is actually that attempt of healing, attempt of processing trauma, attempt of building strength and resilience to keep going and to move on. And I think that's this immense capital, immense potential inherent in any culture. And if we, as people who create culture to some extent, collectively, of course, if we can engage our cultures in a dialogue on that level, on the level of shared pain, but also shared healing, shared strategies of healing, I think that's when we succeed, when we build that empathy that you, Catherine, have mentioned. That's when we succeed. And when we think about that humanity that Jockey was mentioning, that's when we succeed. But again, it's just so incredibly important to stop that pain, for those conversations to truly blossom to their full potential.
We have to end there, very sadly, but I need to ask you, so now what? Help us, if you can, to change the cultures around us. Help us support your next action as peacemakers and peacekeepers. Sarah, can we start with you? Give us a so now what?
There's so much to say. So now what? Creative education has a really powerful role to play in that process of fostering dialogue, fostering healing, fostering conflict transformation. I'm talking about creative education, both in terms of the art side of education and also critical education in terms of unpacking the ideas and assumptions that we come with. I really want to underscore the importance of education in this whole question of peace building and cultures of peace and cultures of conflict. I really want to, if I have only one final message to say, it's to say that a divided humanity can only produce a divided world. We really have to shift the way we're thinking. And towards that end, I want to launch a call for action in the field of formal education. Non-formal education is already a very creative space for peace building. More needs to be done in the area of formal education. Education systems are jealously guarded by political agendas, and they are the seedbeds of nationalism and discrimination. In many cases, we have to really critically look at our formal education systems. Kenya has a wonderful peace education, national peace education program, to my knowledge, but that's a rare example. Other countries need to follow that example and to integrate peace education and peace building at all levels, not relegating it just as a soft skill in primary education, but taking it as a critical issue through secondary education and into higher education across all disciplines. And my second now what is a forthcoming publication of a Routledge International Handbook on trauma responsive peace building, which I am the co-editor for. So hopefully I'll be able to share some news of that in the coming months. But that's also a big part, one piece of this bigger puzzle, I would say, of how to effectively pursue sustainable peace building and break these cycles of violence.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and congratulations on that forthcoming book. Jockey, you're in the higher education sector. What's your so now what? Can you reform the narrative where you are?
Yes, and I agree with Sarah. It's one of the most difficult places to reform because in higher education, people come with very interesting political agendas, which are mostly conservative, patriarchal, capitalist, heteronormative, white. So everything that actually is about dealing with the other. But I one of the things actually for me I've been able to do, I believe even as an individual lecturer, teacher in my classes, is actually doing peace education in everything that I teach. And I believe many of my students have come out of that class more empathetic of the other, because I'm always stressing we need to stand in the other gaps, and it's a journey. I think many academics are not ready to do that because it's beyond sometimes the curriculum. But so it's true, universities need to have almost a compulsory course, and not just one of those tick box diversity courses, but more critical, that is creative, where people work through these issues. And it's not just something they come to class and do, but something they work through practically over time till that transformation can happen, to see the other person and to see their utu, to see their humanity, right? So that we can live as these interconnected people. So one, education all through. Parenting, I think many of us parents are really the cause of the many divisions we see in society, because also we did not get that peace education that helps us to be empathetic. So we can call it parental education. And then going to now social media. Now everybody's on TikTok, but the kind of also toxicity that is spread there, how do we get there so that popular media and use it as a tool for this cultures of peace, of education, parental education, or parents knowing or being more deliberate to creating this Ubuntu society, and teachers, not just through primary school, but all through to higher education. Maybe we can get there.
Thank you, Jockey. And it's not lost on me the extraordinary rarity of having four of us, four women, four mothers, four different contexts, four different backgrounds, cultures. Here we are talking about peace. And I feel maybe, it starts here with all of these conversations like this, however small or large they are. Irene, I'm going to leave you the final word. What's your so now what?
I love how we all have been speaking about this incredibly important issue of those toxic, oppressive narratives, right? So I think my call to action would be to help dismantle those oppressive narratives. And I mean, they can be many. So any story that tells you, I am better than you because of, and you can put anything at the end of that sentence, because of your skin color, because of the language you speak, because of how you identify, because of who you love, because of where you come from, because of what you look like, etc. So all those narratives, they really need to be undermined, they need to be taken apart, new things need to emerge in their place. And when I speak about the post-colonial heritage that also needs to be really the colonial past that needs to be dismantled and sort of extracted from the present, really, because it's almost like there are shards of it still stuck in the present, still hurting people in the present. But for that to happen, I mean, a lot of that work really is to be done by communities bearing the burden of that oppression. However, for those communities to be able to do that work, they really need space to do it. So they need to be safeguarded by the global community from, in many cases, from the imperial powers in the past that are trying to disrupt those decolonization processes in the present. And so I think that's one side of that call to action that I'm talking about, really help safeguard those communities, help keep them safe where needed, really provide arms for them to be able to protect themselves. And I'm speaking about Ukraine here, of course. But on the other hand, also, one great thing that can be done is really to listen to those communities, to amplify their voices coming from inside the communities that have been hurt by the oppressive narratives, that have been in many cases kept silent. Give them space to speak up. They can. They have fantastic voices coming out of them. You don't need to speak for them, but you need to, where you can, give them space. Invite people from those communities as speakers. Give them platform and let them tell you about what's happening in their communities. Don't tell them. Listen to them. If we listen to each other like that, I think we really can take apart those toxic narratives and take out those shards still stuck in the bodies of our communities. So I'm very hopeful for that.
Irina, that's absolutely beautiful. Thank you very much indeed, all of you. Education, empathy, time, space, listening. doing small things with great love. That seems to be what we've been talking about today, and I have to thank you all so very much for being part of this conversation together. Renowned poet and translator Irena Shuvalova, currently a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Literature, Area Studies and European Languages at the University of Oslo. Activist, consultant and researcher Joki Wamai, Assistant Professor of Politics and International Studies at United States International University Africa in Nairobi, and International Peace Educator Sarah Clark Habibi, Learning Specialist at the Peace Division of the UN Institute for Training and Research in Geneva. It has been sobering and inspiring to talk to you all today. My thanks too to producers Mandy Garner from Gates Cambridge and Nick Saffel from the Central Communications Office at the University of Cambridge. And of course, thanks to all of you for listening. We're brand new, so do let us know what you think. I'm Catherine Galloway, and this was So Now What with Gates Cambridge. Join us again next time for another wicked problem dissected by those determined to do something about it.